All right, welcome to the UFF UCF podcast. I'm Robert Casnell, president of the UFF UCF chapter here in Florida at the University of Central Florida. And we have a very special guest with us today, Devarian Baldwin, who is a professor and historian and is interested in the development of various universities and cities and their downtown campuses. And so those of us at UCF are really interested in this story and this conversation. And so this is the reason I wanted to have Devarian on the podcast to have this conversation. And Devarian, if you don't mind, would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hey, everybody. My name is Devarian Baldwin. I am professor of American Studies at Trinity College and founding director of the Smart Cities Research Lab, also there. And I just recently published the book related to what you're talking about, entitled In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, with Bold Type Books. It's great to be here.
And I will make sure that a link to the book will be in the description for this podcast so people will have easy access to it. And just kind of quickly before we get started, Trinity, is it in New York, Trinity College?
It is in Hartford, Connecticut.
Hartford, Connecticut, okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right, fantastic. So I know you're interested in the connection between universities, downtown cities, and the development of, I guess, independent campuses or branch campuses. I don't know a good way to describe
a combination
campuses.
Of both. Yeah, I mean, the broader concern or interest in this work is tracking higher education's growing influence over the economic development and urban governance of urban America, or what I call UniverCities. But on the other side, also, I tell the story in this work of those everyday residents who struggle to survive and thrive in the shadows of these university-based expansions in our cities. If you all don't know, right before our eyes, all over the country, colleges and universities have become the biggest employers, real estate owners, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities and college towns. I mean, USC is the largest private employer in Los Angeles. NYU and Columbia are two of the biggest landholders in New York City. The University of Chicago fields one of the largest private security forces in the world, with jurisdiction over 65,000 non-student residents. So these examples, they point to a larger phenomena that's shaping cities and their residents all over the country. Now, let's be clear. This trade-off can have positive impacts. Colleges and universities bring ideas and people together, and they generate what the key word is today, they create new innovations. They draw capital, they draw people back into the city for a tax base. They might renovate certain blocks of downtown areas that have been divested by putting in dorms or buildings, or they might attract private investors in the med tech or bioscience fields. But at the same time, there is a cost for those who live in the shadows of these ivory towers. Campus expansions also raise housing costs and displace residents, largely in neighborhoods of color or working class communities that surround campuses. Campus police surveil and profile the same residents and are rarely held to public account. And higher education's broad control over labor can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts. The main point here is that this is not just an ivory tower phenomenon, because universities have such a growing influence on not just their campuses, but our cities writ large. It's these schools that are setting the housing costs and land values, the wage ceilings, the healthcare standards, and the policing priorities for whole cities. And that's the main takeaway here.
So I know there's like a great literature on urban renewal,
Mhm.
gentrification, and things like this. Does what you're describing represent kind of a current iteration of that, or this actually go back and is contemporary to those 70s and 80s urban renewal efforts?
Yeah, it's both. That's a great question. It's both because we don't look back at the time of the 1950s and 60s, the period of the grand period of urban renewal, the age of the bulldozer, if you will, for communities in the city. We don't acknowledge the degree to which universities were central in that story. And so in the book and the work, I try to highlight and kind of isolate the fact that in the 50s and 60s, it was universities and urban universities. So NYU, Columbia, Berkeley, U Chicago, University of Alabama, Birmingham, University of Georgia. These schools got together and created a lobbying group to say, okay, there's this urban renewal money. How can we get in the game? And so, in a very specific way, universities became the friendly face of urban renewal with something like the 112 credits program, which is an amendment to the Housing Act of 1949 that basically said if you have an urban development project that's tied to a university, the federal government will give you $2 for every dollar you spend. So then you have cities all over the country scrambling to create urban renewal projects that are associated with a university to get that extra federal money. So, for example, places far flung as the Aurora campus in Denver, Colorado, was a product of this 112 credits program. UPenn's University City was a product of this program. So there's that story, the historical period. But in the new era, it's not just that universities and colleges are grafting on to a larger federal project of urban renewal. In the current moment, with the fall of the House of Factories, universities have become the new factories. They become the new engines of our economy, what we're calling the knowledge economy, where academic research and labor is used to produce goods and patents in a range of areas, from bioscience to pharmaceuticals to military defense weaponry, to generate millions of dollars in revenues that come back to the university and by extension the cities. So as these universities have become this primary economic engine, they're not just a minor player as they were in the urban renewal era. They are the major player in shaping development in cities, in shaping the decision-making processes of City Hall. And so we're entering into a new era, this era of what we call the knowledge economy. And so from that, you have these various developers that only specialize in higher education-based development. Groups like Wexford Development Company. They focus just on building urban research parks or districts, innovation districts, knowledge communities, creative villages, all these different kinds of areas that consolidate not just higher ed labor, but labor, retail, housing, all in these kind of knowledge clusters. And because they are affiliated with universities, most of this work is tax exempt. And so you get all this federal money, this local municipal money, and it falls under the shelter of higher education as being presumed to be a nonprofit, and hence its property holdings being primarily tax exempt, unless you have push from the outside to assess the actual land use.
One of the things too that's sort of interesting, I'm unfamiliar with the research other than what I've read in your own work, is there a difference between, because you use the example of UAB, so is there a difference when a university is housed in a city center versus a university that's not yet moves to a city center? Like, I guess the differences might be between University of Alabama at Birmingham, that is a city-centered campus, versus Arizona State University, which is actually in a suburb, yet they built a downtown campus to access these funds. I mean, is there a difference in these processes? I mean, is it more natural for the Birmingham example to exist than, say, the Tempe Phoenix?
Well, number one, their urban developments happen in critically different times. So in the University of Alabama Birmingham case, what you have is in the 60s and 70s. It's happening earlier in the later period of the urban renewal policy, where the expansion of the Alabama Birmingham campus becomes an extension or a modernization of already existing Jim Crow practices. That there was these Black communities that were existing where they would come to the medical campus to get, ironically, there was the UAB Medical Center was one of the few places that would actually service African American residents for medical treatment. But at the same time, in this period, the University of Alabama campus begins to expand and displace residents from that surrounding area. So that is a difference. In the Arizona State campus perspective, Arizona has a decidedly anti-urban ethos. It's Phoenix has kind of been for decades a donut city. All the development happened on the outskirts in suburban or near suburban areas. It wasn't until this latest iteration of the knowledge economy where Arizona State, because the Tempe, the main campus, is landlocked, they couldn't make way for all of the research and development that they wanted to bring to the market. So what they needed to do was get students off the main campus so they could make way for research and development. And so the downtown campus primarily became a holding pen. It's been sold as in other ways as being an economic engine, as expanding the public good of higher education. But when I talk to insiders, they're saying what it really was a way to move undergraduates off the main campus so that the factory work, the work that was going on the main campus, could be done to bring research to market and generate revenue, as the state contributes less to public higher education. And so I think these are the differences that, University of Alabama, Birmingham, and other urban campuses for decades had turned inward, had turned their backs on cities where they couldn't move from. And then in the 90s, they began to slowly tell a different story and saying that, well, part of our job is to save these inner cities that we've been in. We've been here. And so we're going to expand out into these areas to create these new urban locales that can bring in research, can bring in investors, can bring in families and say it's safe with its own police force, et cetera. Whereas compared to Arizona State or more suburban campuses, they're trying to get into that game. Right.
So we've been trying to have conversations, I know, on our campus and through our union about faculty governance and sort of what's happened to faculty governance. And I know I've hosted a couple of podcast episodes dedicated to that question. And I'm wondering here, and this is just based on my experience as a faculty member, we have a downtown campus here in Orlando. And I'm wondering, is there a role for faculty governance in these processes, or is this happening because of the elimination of faculty governance in the entire process, right? That it's unnecessary for these institutions to have faculty input on these processes because faculty input was extinguished a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to both your questions is yes. So what I mean by, let's go through one at a time. So the faculty should have a role, should have a say in these processes, because they use, again, as I said before, the cover of higher education, both from a fiscal standpoint, but also from a legitimacy standpoint. They use the status of the institution to engage in these expansion and development projects. And the answer to your second question is yes, because the reason why they don't have a role, and I don't want to knock AAUP or the history of campus organizing from a faculty standpoint, but we conceded as faculty, and I'm a faculty member as well, we conceded faculty governance to just simply being what we will concern ourselves with everything associated with the curriculum. And administration, as years have gone forward, has said, okay, well, as the role of higher education is increasingly less about curriculum and education, and is much more about labor and development, that's fine. You handle the curriculum, but that's become increasingly a much smaller part of what happens on campus. A good friend of mine says, as he endorses this project, he says, reading my work made him realize that teaching classes has become a side hustle on colleges and university campuses, because what they mostly are doing is they're an employer and they're a downtown or a real estate developer, and they're a policing apparatus, and they're a healthcare provider. And so I'm arguing, and I'm talking to my own school about this and pushing them on these issues, is that in the same way that, for example, in sports, the NCAA uses the the educational side, the status of education, as a way to graft millions of dollars from so-called student athletes through the amateur status. It's because of their status. It's because of the educational status that the NCAA and their private partners are able to graft all these millions of dollars. Well, the point that I'm making is that it's the educational status that makes that possible, and therefore the non-educational development that goes on that is built on the educational status should come under the purview of faculty governance. And so these other developers, the non-educational side of higher education, they understand that. They use the legitimacy of the educational side to engage in their non-educational endeavors. But we as faculty have not galvanized and said we are no longer going to just simply stay in our lane on the curriculum piece. And we're going to get involved in all aspects of the educational apparatus or the educational endeavor. And I hope that the framework that my work offers demonstrates to all who care why we need to be involved, because all these things are connected. We need a more comprehensive understanding of the current higher education landscape.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been employing the phrase, and I'm certain I didn't make it up. I probably stole it from somewhere, but I've been saying that for a long time now, that universities, have become engines for development, no longer houses of higher learning.
Well, I'll give you a better anecdote. When a group of residents that lived in the neighborhoods of the historically Black Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood in Princeton, New Jersey, when they saw that these are homeowners, when they saw their mortgage costs going up because the mill rate was going up because the assessments of their properties, but there was no improvements in the neighborhood, they wondered why. And they realized that their homes were sitting next to these Princeton University campus buildings, where Eli Lilly was partnering with the university to produce millions of dollars in royalties for research and development. And they actually filed a lawsuit and won an $18 million lawsuit to compensate them for their losses in property taxes, because the university didn't pay, but yet they were reaping benefits off of not being required to pay. And one resident was so disgusted by what he discovered, he dismissed Princeton as simply a hedge fund that conducts classes.
That is great. All right, Devarian, thank you again for joining me today.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thanks. I hope we can do it again at some point.
Absolutely. I got a feeling this conversation will continue. I know there's many people here at UCF that are interested in this conversation, so it will move forward.
Yeah, much more to discuss. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.